All right. Steve Street, IT architect for IBM. Thank you for talking to the AIM Practice video today. How important is it for industry to work with academia today?
I think, to be serious, it's probably more important than they realise. I think there's quite there's a unique value, perhaps we'll talk about that later, a unique value to collaborating, moving outside of the day job and connecting to academic institutions. It's easy to be overlooked in today's era. So
why is it easy to be overlooked, and how do these industry academia collaborations work?
Yes, I mean, I think the day job, I think is very compelling, particularly in what the Spanish would call the crisis. There's so much going on in the front line of the day job. It's easy to lose track of the fact you should be looking further ahead. Now, as to how these things happen, yeah, all kinds of different ways, I think. Sometimes companies go deliberately seeking academic collaboration. And that, we'll talk more about that perhaps. I mean, that does work. Sometimes, I mean, in our case, in the case of IBM, I think we generally believe it's a good thing to broaden out and make connections that aren't standard day job type connections.
And sort of, how do you go about sort of deciding what the benefits and challenges are when you're in an industry, you're working with academics? The cultures must be different. There must be culture clashes. So how do you go about it, and why are they important?
I'll probably not answer that fully, but what can I say? Yeah, culture in some ways can be very, very similar. I've noticed in academia, in some ways, it's even more ruthlessly day-to-day funding focused than we would necessarily be in industry. I think one of the key secrets actually is to be prepared to take a risk. To go out and find out what's out there, what's going on, and let it surprise you to a certain degree. I'm quite sure that some of my other collaborators were not naturally interested in talking to the Institute for Manufacturing about maintenance systems, but they're surprised to find the value that they can derive there. And
do you know why you go about them? Is it always in pursuit of profit?
No, it's certainly not in pursuit of profit. In fact, a very dangerous thing to try and pursue profit too assiduously. I mean, we're not naive. We are interested in getting some value back into the business, but we do recognise that's not necessarily going to be a short-term prospect. We just make investments, and very often they pay off, not necessarily in the way you'd expect in the short term.
And how do you go about building these relationships? Is it word of mouth? Do you have established partners that you work with, or would you consider new collaborations?
Well, yeah, in the case of IBM, there is a tendency for wherever there's a big IBM site for there to be quite a close connection to the local universities, partly because we encourage engagement with universities in general. I mean, most of our sort of senior technical staff are expected to be doing something that's outside of their day job. And university collaboration is one of the more popular things. But, hey, there are IBMers everywhere in the UK. And we're very interested to hear of new things and to make, as I say, new connections.
And what about your connections here with the AIM practice? Is that an exciting one for you, as a special relationship that you've been building up?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think in many ways it's very much a matter of individuals and personal connections, which then tend to fall under the AIM umbrella. I mean, part of our connection was, shall I mention it, to the Judge Business School. And that's historical because I turn out by a freak of fate to be one of the alumni. And that brought us into contact with Andy and a lot of connections to Cranfield, which is quite an interesting place from our point of view.
And so that, how exciting is it to actually be in industry, then come to academia, perhaps just listen to something and the penny drops and you think, gosh, I've never thought of that before. Is there revelation in this relationship?
Yeah, indeed. Revelation is probably exactly the right word. There are occasions where you come across something, I use the word connection a lot, some idea you'd never thought about, something you'd never thought about in a particular context. And yeah, exactly, the world becomes wide open in front of you, which I'd say is revelation, actually. Okay,
and is that revelation, can you equate it with a winning idea? Do you spot a winning idea immediately, or do you think, gosh, I'm not going to do that, that's fool's gold? Or how do you know what ideas to pursue?
I think it tends to be a relatively long-term thing that comes out of a relationship. It's very unlikely, I think, you do get the revelation moment, and usually those need meditating and mulling on before you can come up with anything actually concrete out of it. So I think it tends to be actually a cumulative process, including exciting bits and less exciting bits, which will then point you to something practical you can do. But actually, we don't mind in some ways if we don't find in the short term anything practical, because in the long term, you know, the relationships will pay off.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Do you object to the phrase, perhaps a winning idea? Because that means that actually everything's got to come together in about 9 months and you say eureka, or you know, are the relationships more nuanced than that?
They're definitely more nuanced. In fact, if we do find a winning idea, nobody would be very upset about it. But we'd be really surprised if we could find something. I mean, one of the things I think we do try and avoid is going for something that's got to pay off, you know, in a short time frame, because it's just so difficult to make that happen. And it puts on natural pressure. It forces people to do things that they wouldn't have wanted to do, you know, to try and meet some arbitrary deadline. It's not a sensible thing to do in the end.
Right. And is it difficult to deliver what you promise? You come away, you know, you get into the moment at these conferences, you're talking to academia. Do you go away and scratch your head and say, well, gosh, how do we manage these expectations of others involved in this project? Is managing expectations tricky? Yeah,
managing expectations actually is key. I mean, I think it's actually quite surprising what you can manage if you're committed to doing so. I mean, we do seek to give people a bit of space, a bit of time to think. And it's quite, in fact, in some ways you could say you're actually more engaged if you've got stuff outside of the day job, and it's just remarkable what you can do. Nonetheless, you know, sensible expectations do have to be set, particularly when it comes to funding and money, that sort of thing.
Okay, well, I was going to ask you that. How do you balance the academia and industry interests? Do you think, gosh, I'm spending far too much time with AIM practice consultants and not enough time at my desk, my line manager isn't going to like it? Is there a balancing of these two interests?
Oh, without any doubt, there's a balancing of these two interests. And in the final analysis, you have to meet your industry commitments. You just don't really have a choice about that. But you know, the company actually it recognises that you should and ought to do this kind of thing outside your routine activity, and so the company can be quite supportive.
And do you know that perhaps your interests are different from those of academia? You know, how is there conflicts?
Yes, conflict not in the sense of people hitting each other, but conflict in the sense of that our interests are not always aligned. In fact, to be quite honest, our interests are sometimes lower key and more longer term than the academics. You know, students here for a year, the students doing a thesis in a period of 6 weeks, you know, that's quite challenging to us.
So what do you think that you want as an industrialist from academia?
Yeah, and new thinking, perestroika, I think that's the phrase, isn't it? New vision, I used the word connection before, and I think new connections are incredibly useful to make. I mean, seriously, we don't want cheap programmers. I think there is a risk that universities think they need to provide a student who will program something cheaply, and that is definitely not what we're after. We're after what we can't do ourselves.
Now, if we have a look at your information systems that you're working with, there's a merger, isn't there, of the agendas of the private and public information sources and projects. How do you, if you like, balance those interests, and might it not be problematic given that both have different values underpinning them, sensitive data sharing issues, particularly in the public sector?
Oh, I think that this is a subject that's not worked out yet. I mean, one of my themes at work is security. And there are legal requirements and things you have to adhere to. I think we've not yet found, I think people tend to go from extremes. They go from extreme protection to extreme openness. I'm not sure which area we're in at the moment, but clearly there needs to be a balance to be struck, which we have not necessarily always found. I mean, in the end, I think we're into the, quote, open source world. You know, ideas will go out there and thrive. But,
and data sharing is sensitive.
It can be. It can be. I mean, in fact, the ideal thing is to make it not sensitive and not to be excessively worried about it. It does not help to be too obsessed with protecting data, but you have to be aware of your responsibilities.